Okay, let's take a look at impact in Studio One. Now I'm using 2.6 version in this video, Studio One 2.6, but impact is going to be the same no matter what version you're using. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to click on Instruments there, and you can see we've got impact among the PreSonus instruments available to us. If we click this down arrow, we can expand it out and take a look at some of the kits that are included, and we can either just drag that impact in or we can drag a kit in. So I'm just going to grab the top one here and I'll put it down below here, and I actually want to move that up. I've actually got a couple or one other impact in here as well, and I want to have those two together. And actually I think I'm going to bring this audio down. Okay, so we just brought in the 60s kit, and I'm just going to start from the very top and cover every function within impact. This is going to be a part one. I'll briefly go over these sections here, but I'm going to do a more in-depth video in part two that actually covers the attack, the hold and the decay, and all of these functions in depth. But let's go ahead and get started here. At the very top right, we can see we can choose between our instances of impact that we have open. We can rename, remove, or show in the console. Next to that, we can choose between the two instances of impact that I have open. Next, we have a power button. We can turn impact off. We also have bypass next to that. Then here we can store a preset. Maybe if we've made some adjustments and loaded samples, we can store that, and then we can choose it. It would show up here in the browser, as well as this next section here, which we'll talk about. These are all of the kits that we have available to us, and if we had went ahead and saved a kit, it would show up here. And I actually have a kit here called My Preset. It's not the most original name, but this is one that I have used this menu to store a preset. And what I stored was I changed the mappings for the drum pads to how it works best with my MIDI keyboard controller that has pads on it. Because within impact, as it comes, it starts with B0, and that just doesn't work well for me, so I remapped everything and stored that as a preset. And this is how we can access our own presets or other kits. Next to that, we have channel. If we click on that, this will give us an overview of all of the different channels that are active. So you can see we've got stereo 1, stereo 2, all the way through stereo 7 are active. It doesn't look like any of the monos are being used. If we look below at the pads, we can see stereo 7, 5, 3, 2, and so on. These are being used, and that's why they are showing as active here. We can deselect it, and the audio will not be sent out. So even if this says stereo 7, if we disconnect 7 here, there will be no audio going through. Now we've got some controls for automation here, and I'll actually cover that in part 2, but just know that you can quickly access read, touch, latch, and write, and add and remove parameters here. We've got a gear icon here. If we select that, we can open up these windows, which will give us controls for automation, as well as control link and mapping controls on our keyboard controller to various parameters within impact. And we'll take a look at that as well. And actually, I'll just go ahead and we'll do that really quickly now. So if I would like to map, say, the transpose here, I can turn this knob, and then I'll turn a knob, one of the rotary knobs on my MIDI controller. As you can see, this second window has now populated with K1. That is what the knob is called on my device, which is a MPK Mini. I can then just click this link button, and now you can see that I've got control of the transpose with my MIDI controller. So it's just as simple as that if you want to map your controls. Now, what else have we got? This down arrow, we can choose a different controller. As I mentioned, I'm using the MPK Mini, so that's what I have it set for. But I can also choose a QWERTY keyboard if I am on the road and don't have a keyboard attached. Now moving on, we can take a look at the pads here. So we can trigger these by clicking. Also, if I get the correct bank here on my controller, I can trigger with, I'm using the pads on my keyboard controller. I can also use the keys as well. And upon selecting these pads or clicking on them, you will notice here above, this is our sample viewer. We can see the samples that are included. We can see a visual representation of the samples that are assigned to each pad. And it's within this window that we can then make some adjustments here to the length of that sample. We also see the name of the sample here. Now, in order to make an adjustment to this as far as the length of it is concerned, we can come to either edge, and you see we get a little finger there, and we can just click and hold, drag that in, and then you can see that this then adjusts the playback. Of our sample. Now we also have this offset start and end here, so this functions in a similar way. If I drag this up, what I'm doing is altering the start of the sample. So you can see it's trimming it just the same way as when we dragged up above here. Okay, and so that's what those are for. Just below our sample view here, we can zoom in. We have a zoom control here. This was a little bit tricky for me in the beginning. The best way to use this is to always click on the right-hand side. And the further you move towards the left, the more it's going to zoom in. So if I just click farther to the right here, we're going to zoom in just a little bit. And then as I move towards the left, we get in even closer. And I kind of wanted to grab this darker area and kind of move around the sample by dragging this. But the best way to work this is just clicking to the right, and just know that the further to the right, you're going to zoom in less. The further you jump down to the left here, it's going to zoom in even more. And you cannot drag this darker area. I mean, move it like a bar, left or right. You can drag it to zoom back out. As we zoom in, we can then use this, and you can drag this and move around your sample. So if I want to zoom back out, I can just click over to the right, and there we are. Just below these controls, we have a add and remove sample. So if we just click the plus, then we get a navigation window here where we can navigate to a folder where we have samples stored. A simpler way may be just to come to the file section here and drag it in from that window. But this is yet another option that we have. If I click the minus button, then it's going to remove that sample. Now, the previous and next button are going to move left or right to different samples within the folder that we're in. So if I actually come to my files here, and I've got some drum samples here. If I just bring in this kick and say drag it and put it on this cell, I can then click next, and it's going to move on to the next sample within this folder. So this is yet another way that we can choose our samples and just come along and move down within the folder here. After we've brought a different sample in, we can right click on a pad and rename. I'm just going to call this one kick. Click OK, and that's been accepted. Other controls that we have available to us by right clicking would be to replace sample, which will again give us that window where we can navigate to where we may have samples stored. Right clicking again, we can add sample. Rename, which we just did, we can select it in the pool. So that would be here. Right clicking again, we can clear our pad, and we can also choose different ways that this pad is going to be, how it's going to respond when it's triggered. Now these controls are also available down at the bottom here, and I'm just going to cover those when we make our way down here. So next, what we have here in our pads are the notes that will trigger the pad, and we can choose 2 different ones, and this could be useful for if you would like to layer your pads. If you'd like to have 2 sounds to be triggered at once, then you could say assign the same note to 2 different pads. And let's take a look at how that's done, and at the same time we can cover how you can actually assign the pads. What we do is, you can see we have D2 and D5. These both will trigger this, and we can change that by coming here, and then we would just click, and then we can type in manually. A simpler way of doing this is if I click once and then I'm going to press a pad on my MIDI controller, and it's going to fill that in for me. So I can just click like that, and then it will set this for me automatically. Now if I want these both to play at the same time, then I'll just come down and so now whenever I hit this one pad on my controller, I'm triggering both, so I've got these layered together. And just know that this can be done, and you know, that's how we can go ahead and map out our keys or pads to the pads within Impact. So this also will work for if you're using your keyboard. You can just hit a key on your keyboard and it will map that as well. Now below this we have a solo and mute button. So we can solo our pad. We can also mute it if we don't want to hear that audio. And to the right of that we can choose our output. And when we click, we can see these that are already set. Anything that has a white box next to it is active, or it's being used by a pad somewhere within Impact. Now these are not in use, and because we don't have that white box next to them. So all of these are available to us, and within Impact we can choose from 1 of 8 mono or 1 of 8 stereo. And you can use the outputs on more than one cell, so they're not just limited. So if we look within the pads here, we can see that stereo 4 is used multiple times here. Now going back to the topic of layering, we can actually create velocity layers within these pads. You can have up to 3, and the way that we would do that is I'll layer this one here. So if I come back over to my drum samples, what you'd want to do is hold down Shift after selecting and then drag that in while holding Shift, and you can see we now have this gray bar that has shown up here. Now this is indicating that the sample we just brought in has made a change here, and this shows each one of the samples. So this is the original, and you can see it's named as such. Now this is the one that we just brought in, and we can even click this area here and choose between them. And I'm going to go ahead and bring in yet another one, holding down Shift. Now you can see we have 3 divisions, and we can choose our different samples by clicking up above here. If you would like to make adjustments, you would need to be sure that the correct one is selected. We can also again click up top here. You can also drag along these borders and change the velocity sensitivity setting. So I'm just using the same pad, and as you can see or hear, changing between the samples depending on how hard I'm striking the pad. And then, like I said, you can adjust the sensitivity by using these sliders here. Now, something else that corresponds with the velocity, layering the velocities here, is we can choose the manner in which that plays back when the pad is triggered. By default, it's set to velocity, but down here, this is our layer mode, and we can choose how it will respond. Now, round robin will cycle between all 3 of them. I'm just hitting the pad over and over, and it's cycling between them. Now, there is a random here, which is obvious. It's just going to play them back randomly when you're striking the pad. And while we're here, let's take a look at the play mode. This is going to also determine how the pads play back, not necessarily with the velocity, but let's move over to this other impact. I've actually brought in a longer sample because I want to make this really clear on how this works. I've got a longer sample. Okay, so by default, this is set to play as one-shot poly. So if I keep hitting it, it's going to layer them on top of each other and keep going until the sample ends. The other options that we have available to us are one-shot mono. So with this, it's going to start over each time I trigger it and not play all the way through until I stop pressing it. Now the next one that we have is toggle. So if I press it once, and I can press it again, and that will stop the sample from playing back. So pressing it, I'm released from the pad, it's playing back, I'll hit the pad again and it stops. That's toggle. Note on, note off. With this, if I press and hold the pad on my MIDI controller, it's going to play the sample as long as I'm holding the pad down. So I'm going to press and hold the pad. Now I'm going to release it. Okay, and so that is what the note on and note off is. And so that's the 4 different modes that you can choose from for the playback when the pads are triggered. Now next to this we have sync, and this is almost similar to having quantize on while you're recording and playing your drum pads on your keyboard controller. If you enable sync, then whenever you trigger this pad, it's going to basically quantize it and put it next to the closest beat to whatever you have your quantize setting. So I've got it at 16th notes. So if I'm triggering this while I'm recording, then with the sync engage down here, then it's going to basically put it to the nearest 16th within the arranger. So it's kind of similar to having the quantize on while you're recording. Just another way of going about doing that. Now moving on, we're going to take a look at the pitch, filter, and amp sections. And again, I'll go over these in more detail in part 2, but we'll take a brief look at them now. So if I'm triggering, say, snare 1, you want to be sure that if you're going to work with these sections, you select the pad first and be sure that it's highlighted. So transpose, it's pretty obvious here what that's going to do. And then we can tune that for finer adjustments. If you're ever tweaking these and you want to go back to the default setting, you can just hold down Control on your keyboard and click, and that will take you back to the default setting. And then you've got attack, hold, and decay settings, and we'll go over all of that in part 2. Next, you have a filter, which you can use to adjust cutoff and resonance. And then you've got a section here for choosing different filter types, low pass, band pass, high pass, with different slopes. And then down below that we've got our amp section. So we've got an area for panning, and volume. And each one of these sections can be turned on and off by clicking on this LED here. Or I should say the filter can be turned on and off by clicking its LED. Now we've got one other thing down here at the bottom that I didn't cover, and that's the choke. So we can set up different groups of pads so that one will silence the other if they are triggered. So I've got this longer sample. Now, if I would like to stop that, say with this bass drum, I can select the bass drum, put that into choke group 1. I'll select this other and put that into the same group. Now, you can see that the bass drum now will stop the other one from playing here. And this is useful for if you're trying to have more realistic hi-hats or something like that, but you can also use it for other creative instances or something like this where you have a longer sample and you just want to be able to stop it with another pad. Now the last thing we'll cover in part 1 here is the stretch factor, and this is just a stretch function that's included in Impact. When it's set to 1, then it's going to play your sample back as it is when you drag it in. So if I come to this one here, now if I change this to 2, then it's going to play it back twice as fast. If I were to change it to 0.5, then it's going to play it back half as fast. So if I change this to 2, then it's made some alterations in processing, and if I trigger it again, so it keeps the pitch the same, but it speeds it up, and that's what that stretch factor is. So I hope you found some useful tips in this, and look out for part 2, where I'm going to be covering all of the controls in the pitch, filter, and amp section in greater detail.